This is going to be a reading from the 1953 collaborative volume, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, which is edited by Harry Elmer Barnes, who was a major American historian of the first half of the 20th century, who was very influential. This book is dedicated to the memory of Charles Austin Beard, and it begins with an epigraphic poem by Eugene Davidson dedicated to Charles Austin Beard. I'm going to read the preface. This is also by Harry Elmer Barnes. This book is a critical survey and appraisal of the development of American foreign policy during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt and of its results as they have affected the course of world history, the national interest of the United States, and the welfare of its citizens. It was originally conceived by the editor as an answer to Basil Rauch's Roosevelt from Munich to Pearl Harbor, the first full-sized effort to whitewash the interventionist foreign policy of President Roosevelt. When the prospective contributors were approached, they, without exception, questioned the logic and wisdom of directing the fire of a piece of heavy artillery against a mouse, however sleek and pretentious. They suggested instead a comprehensive review of the interventionist foreign policy since 1937, which would constitute an effective and enduring answer to the whitewashing and blackout contingents as a group, present and future. The editor has deferred to their superior judgment. Professor Rauch's contentions, however, receive adequate attention, not only incidentally throughout the volume, but directly in the chapter by Professor Lundberg. The book here presented is not only an account of the actual course and aftermath of Roosevelt diplomacy, such as has already been factually and courageously set forth by George Morgenstern, Charles Austin Beard, Frederick R. Sanborn, William Henry Chamberlain, and Charles Callan Tansel, but it is also a consideration of the background and results of this diplomacy, and of the great difficulties met today by historians, social scientists, and publicists who honestly seek to discover and publish the facts relative to the foreign policies of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman. But the book is not a partisan polemic. The editor and the contributors fully recognize that more can be said in defense of the foreign policy of Messrs. Roosevelt and Truman than in behalf of the fantastic policy of their bipartisan Republican supporters, who cannot even invoke realistic political expediency in support of their attitude and conduct. Even much of the Republican criticism of the Roosevelt-Truman foreign policy boils down to little more than the allegation that it has not been sufficiently aggressive, ruthless, and global. The title of this book was suggested to the editor by the late Charles Austin Beard in our last conversation. With the characteristic cogency and incisiveness, Beard held that the foreign policy of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman and of their ideological supporters, whether Democrats, Republicans, Socialists, or Communists, could most accurately and precisely be described by the phrase perpetual war for perpetual peace. Events since that time, June 1947, have further reinforced Beard's sagacity and insight in this respect. George Orwell's brilliant and profoundly prophetic novel, 1984, has since shown how a new political order throughout the world may be erected on the premises and implications of this goal of perpetual war, presented in the guise of a global struggle of free peoples for perpetual peace. There is already alarming evidence that this is just the type of regime into which the world is now moving, consciously or unconsciously, as a result of the foreign policy forged by Roosevelt, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. The main practical purpose of this volume is to acquaint the American public with this fact before we reach the point of no return, and it is too late to revise our course and resume a sane foreign policy based on continentalism, national interest, ideological coexistence, international urbanity, and rational cooperation in world affairs. If trends continue as they have during the last 15 years, we shall soon reach this point of no return, and can only anticipate interminable wars disguised as noble gestures for peace. Such an era could only culminate in a third world war, which might well, as Arnold J. Toynbee has suggested, leave only the pygmies in remote jungles, or even the apes and ants, to carry on, quote, the cultural traditions of mankind. The contributors to this volume represent the outstanding living revisionist historians, social scientists, and publicists who have thus far contributed actively to the furtherance of revisionist studies relative to the Second World War. Each is a specialist in the field which he treats in his chapter. An effort has been made to cover adequately all the main aspects of the recent foreign policy of the United States. The editor, and that's Barnes referring to himself here, deals with the blackout of material concerning the revisionist position relative to responsibility for the Second World War and the Cold War. Professor Tansel covers the European background of the origins of the Second World War and the development of Japanese-American relations to the eve of Pearl Harbor. Dr. Sanborn describes the origin of the interventionist foreign policy of President Roosevelt, his words and actions bearing on European diplomacy prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, the flagrant and ever-increasing violations of neutrality by the Roosevelt administration, and the fruitless efforts of Mr. Roosevelt to induce Germany and Italy to react to this policy by making a declaration of war on the United States. Professor Neumann treats the broader background of the American attitude of studied hostility toward Japan, as exemplified in the diplomacy of Secretaries Stimson and Hull and of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, including also the menacing naval policy of the latter. Mr. Morgenstern provides us with a succinct survey of the diplomacy and events that led us into and through Pearl Harbor. Mr. Greaves relates the scandalous story of fakery and evasion involved in most of the investigations of responsibility for Pearl Harbor and the attempts to discredit such of the investigations as did honestly seek to ascertain the truth. Mr. Chamberlain handles crisply the evidence relating to the complete bankruptcy of the Roosevelt-Hull-Stimson-Morgenthau foreign policy and the incredible and enduring calamities it has imposed on the world of today. Professor Lundberg subjects to sociological analysis the contesting trends in American foreign policy, the continentalism and neutrality which gave us security, prosperity, and peace, and the global meddling, which has reduced our liberties, faced us with national fiscal bankruptcy, plunged us into 2 world wars and headed us ominously toward a third, destroyed our security, and undermined public morale and official integrity. Those readers who are stimulated to pursue further the subjects touched upon in any or all of these chapters will find ample guidance to more detailed literature in the footnotes or bibliographies of these chapters. There is no probability that later evidence will require any moderation of the indictment of our foreign policy since 1914, and especially since 1933. If there were any still secret material which would brighten the record of the Roosevelt and Truman foreign policies, we may rest assured that their court historians and publicity agents would have revealed it to the public long ere this. There is no doubt that the opponents of truth and realism relative to recent world history and to American foreign policy will seek to smear this book as an example of and appeal to isolationism. Such criticism is as silly as it is inevitable today. The authors are all widely traveled men. They are all students of world affairs and of those changes in world conditions which have brought the peoples of the world into closer relationships, at least so far as the agencies of communication and transportation and their cultural impact are concerned. They know that the world has changed since the days of Abraham Lincoln. They favored the utmost possible development in the way of international contacts, relationships, and understanding, and amicable cooperation between the United States and other countries of the world. The only quote-unquote isolationism they embrace is isolation from global meddling and from interference in foreign quarrels which do not vitally concern the interests or security of the United States. They wish isolation from a foreign policy which has brought increasing misery, chaos, and decimation to the world since April 1917, without any notable improvement in world conditions or in the safety and prosperity of our own country. They favor the abandonment of a policy which has increased the number and strength of our foreign enemies, reduced the number and paralyzed the power of our potential friends abroad, and undermined the economic security and political integrity of our nation. They see no reason to doubt that our traditional foreign policy of neutrality, continentalism, and friendly collaboration is more likely to contribute to domestic felicity and military security than global meddling and interventionism, the net result of which has been brilliantly summarized by Mr. Chamberlain as, quote, intellectual, moral, political, and economic bankruptcy, complete and irretrievable, end quote. Over against this, we have the record of our traditional neutrality, which kept the United States free from any major foreign war for a century, and both permitted and encouraged civil liberty, economic expansion, financial solvency, national prosperity, and governmental economy. The editor is deeply indebted to Mr. Eugene F. Hoy of the Caxton Printers Limited for faithful, efficient, and extensive assistance in preparing the manuscript for the printer. The index was compiled by Mr. Charles N. Lurie of New York City. Harry Elmer Barnes, Cooperstown, New York. Chapter 1. Revisionism and the Historical Blackout by Harry Elmer Barnes. There are 3 epigraphs. The first is by Samuel Flagg Bemis, Journal of Modern History, March 1947. The revisionist search for truth relative to the causes of the Second World War is, quote, serious, unfortunate, deplorable, end quote. The second epigraph, also by Samuel Flagg Bemis from the New York Times of October the 15th, 1950. One thing ought to be evident to all of us. By our victory over Germany and Japan, no matter what our folly in losing the peace, we have at least survived to confront the second, even greater menace of another totalitarian power. And the third and final epigraph, by Stuart H. Holbrook, Lost Men of American History, page 42. The folklore of war, of course, begins long before the fighting is done, and by the time the last smoke has drifted away, this folklore has congealed into a truth of a Neolithic hardness. Now, Harry Elmer Barnes has included a 1-page biographical statement about himself. Harry Elmer Barnes was born near Auburn, New York on June 15, 1989. He attended Port Byron High School and Syracuse University, receiving his A.B. degree from the latter institution summa cum laude in 1913. He received his Ph.D. degree from Columbia University in 1918. While at Columbia, he was University Fellow in Historical Sociology and Cutting Traveling Fellow in History. He has taught history and historical sociology at Syracuse University, Barnard College, Columbia University, Clark University, Smith College, Amherst College, Temple University, the University of Colorado, the University of Indiana, and in many university summer schools throughout the country. His most important historical writings are The History of Western Civilization in 2 volumes, 1935, and An Intellectual and Cultural History of the Western World, 1937. Preserved Smith declared that the former is, quote, incontestably the masterpiece of the new history, end quote. Dr. Barnes's chief works in the field of diplomatic history and international relations are The Genesis of the World War, 1926, In Quest of Truth and Justice, 1928, World Politics in Modern Civilization, 1930. He also edited the important series of 6 volumes on American investments abroad, Studies in American Imperialism, 1928 to 1935, sponsored by the American Fund for Public Service. Of the Genesis, Carl Becker wrote that it was, quote, a marvelously straight, swift, cogent presentation of facts and conclusions. And William L. Langer declared that the facts about the responsibility for the First World War, quote, could not be more successfully presented at the present stage of our historical knowledge. Barnes took the lead, with the above-mentioned 3 books and earlier reviews and articles, in arousing popular interest in the causes of the First World War, with the result that the chief authority on the literature of this subject, Dr. George Peabody Gooch, asserted that, quote, no other American scholar has done so much to familiarize his countrymen with the new evidence and to compel them to revise their wartime judgments in the light of this new material. In his substantial brochure, The Struggle Against the Historical Blackout, Barnes has once more become the pioneer in directing public attention to the subject of revisionism, as bearing on the causes of the Second World War and to the great obstacles to the discovery and publication of truth in this field. Now we'll start with Part 1. How War Has Transformed the American Dream into a Nightmare. The First World War and American intervention therein marked an ominous turning point in the history of the United States and of the world. Those who can remember the good old days before 1914 inevitably look back to those times with a very definite and justifiable feeling of nostalgia. There was no income tax before 1913, and that levied in the early days after the amendment was adopted was little more than nominal. All kinds of taxes were relatively low. We had only a token national debt of around $1 billion, which could have been paid off in a year without causing even a ripple in national finance. The total federal budget in 1913 was $724,512,000, just about 1% of the present astronomical budget. Ours was a libertarian country, in which there was little or no witch hunting, and few of the symptoms and operations of the police state which have been developing here so drastically over the last decade. Not until our intervention in the First World War had there been sufficient invasions of individual liberties to call forth the formation of special groups and organizations to protect our civil rights. The Supreme Court could still be relied upon to uphold the Constitution and safeguard the civil liberties of individual citizens. Libertarianism was also dominant in Western Europe. The Liberal Party governed England from 1905 to 1914. France had risen above the reactionary coup of the Dreyfus Affair and had separated church and state and had seemingly established the Third Republic with reasonable permanence on a democratic and liberal basis. Even Hohenzollern Germany enjoyed the usual civil liberties and had strong constitutional restraints on executive tyranny, and had established a workable system of parliamentary government. Experts on the history of Austria-Hungary have recently been proclaiming that life in the dual monarchy after the turn of the century marked the happiest period in the experience of the peoples encompassed therein. Constitutional government, democracy, and civil liberties prevailed in Italy. Despite the suppression of the liberal revolution of 1905, liberal sentiment was making headway in Tsarist Russia, and there was decent prospect that a constitutional monarchy might be established. Civilized states expressed abhorrence of dictatorial and brutal policies. Edward VII of England blacklisted Serbia after the court murders of 1903. Enlightened citizens of the Western world were then filled with buoyant hope for a bright future for humanity. It was believed that the theory of progress had been thoroughly vindicated by historical events. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, published in 1888, was the prophetic Bible of that era. People were confident that the amazing developments in technology would soon produce abundance, security, and leisure for the multitude. In this optimism in regard to the future, no item was more evident and potent than the assumption that war was an outmoded nightmare. Not only did idealism and humanity repudiate war, but Norman Angell and others were assuring us that war could not be justified, even on the basis of the most sordid material interest. Those who adopted a robust international outlook were devoted friends of peace, and virtually all international movements had as their sole aim the devising and implementing of ways and means to assure permanent peace. Friends of peace were nowhere isolationist in any literal sense, but they did stoutly uphold the principle of neutrality and sharply criticized provocative meddling in every political dogfight in the most remote reaches of the planet. In our own country, the traditional American foreign policy of benign neutrality and the wise exhortations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay to avoid entangling alliances and to shun foreign quarrels were still accorded respect in the highest councils of state. Unfortunately, there are relatively few persons today who can recall those happy times. In his devastatingly prophetic book, 1984, George Orwell points out that one reason why it is possible for those in authority to maintain the barbarities of the police state is that nobody is able to recall the many blessings of the period which preceded that type of society. In a general way, this is also true of the peoples of the Western world today. The great majority of them have known only a world ravaged by war, depressions, international intrigues and meddling, vast debts and crushing taxation, the encroachments of the police state, and the control of public opinion and government by ruthless and irresponsible propaganda. A major reason why there's no revolt against such a state of society as that in which we are living today is that many have come to accept it as a normal matter of course, having known nothing else during their lifetimes. A significant and illuminating report on this situation came to me recently in a letter from one of the most distinguished social scientists in the country and a resolute revisionist. He wrote, quote, "I am devoting my seminar this quarter to the subject of American foreign policy since 1933. The effect upon a Roosevelt-bred generation is startling indeed. Even able and mature students react to the elementary facts like children who've just been told that there is, or was, no Santa Claus." End quote. This is also an interesting reflection on the teaching of history today. The members of the seminar were graduate students, nearly all of whom had taken courses in recent American and European history, which covered in some detail the diplomacy of Europe and the United States during the last 20 years. A friend who read the preceding material suggested that laboring men would be likely to give me a quote-unquote horse laugh. That some would is no doubt true, but the essential issue would be the validity of the grounds for doing so. Being a student of the history of labor problems, I'm aware of many gains for labor since 1914. I can remember well when the working day was 10 hours long and the pay was $1.50. But I can also remember when good steak cost 15 cents a pound and the best whiskey was 85 cents a quart. Moreover, the father, even if he earned only $1.50 a day, had every assurance that he could raise his family with his sons free from the shadow of the draft and butchery in behalf of politicians. The threat of war did not hang over him. There are some forms of tyranny worse than that of an arbitrary boss in a non-union shop. Finally, when one considers the increased cost of living and the burden of taxation, it is doubtful if a man who earns $8 a day now is any better off materially than his father or grandfather who earned $1.50 in 1900. For the sad state of the world today, the entry of the United States into 2 world wars has played a larger role than any other single factor. Some might attribute the admittedly unhappy conditions of our time to other items and influences than world wars and our intervention in them. No such explanation can be sustained. Indeed, but for our entry into the 2 world wars, we should be living in a far better manner than we did before 1914. The advances in technology since that time have brought the automobile into universal use, have given us good roads, have produced the airplane, radio, moving pictures, television, electric lighting and refrigeration, and numerous other revolutionary contributions to human service, happiness, and comforts. If all this had been combined with the freedom, absence of high taxation, minimum indebtedness, low armament expenditures, and pacific outlook of pre-1914 times, the people of the United States might, right now, be living in utopian security and abundance. A radio commentator recently pointed out that the one great advantage we have today over 1900 is that death from disease has been reduced and life expectancy considerably increased. But this suggests the query as to whether this is any real gain in the light of present world conditions. Is it an advantage to live longer in a world of thought policing, economic austerity, crushing taxation, inflation, and perpetual warmongering and wars? The rise and influence of communism, military state capitalism, the police state, and the impending doom of civilization have been the penalty exacted for our meddling abroad in situations which did not materially affect either our security or our prestige. Our national security was not even remotely threatened in the case of either world war. There was no clear moral issue impelling us to intervene in either world conflict. The level of civilization was lowered rather than elevated by our intervention. While the First World War headed the United States and the world toward international disaster, the Second World War was an even more calamitous turning point in the history of mankind. It may indeed have brought us and the whole world into the terminal episode of human existence. It certainly marked the transition from social optimism and technological rationalism into the 1984 pattern of life, in which aggressive international policies and war scares have become the guiding factor, not only in world affairs, but also in the domestic, political, and economic strategy of every leading country in the world. The police state has emerged as the dominant political pattern of our times, and military state capitalism is engulfing both democracy and liberty in countries which have not succumbed to communism. The manner and extent to which American culture has been impaired and our well-being undermined by our entry into 2 world wars, has been brilliantly and succinctly stated by Professor Mario A. Pei of Columbia University in an article on, quote, "The America We Lost," in the Saturday Evening Post of May the 3rd, 1952, and has been developed more at length by Garrett in his trenchant book, The People's Pottage. Perhaps, by the mid-century, all this is now water under the bridge, and little can be done about it. But we can surely learn how we got into this unhappy condition of life and society, at least until the police state system continues its current rapid development, sufficiently to obliterate all that remains of integrity and accuracy in historical writing and political reporting. Part 2 of Chapter 1. Revisionism after 2 world wars. The readjustment of historical writing to historical facts relative to the background and causes of the First World War, what is popularly known in historical craft as revisionism, was the most important development in historiography during the decade of the 1920s. While those historians at all receptive to the facts admitted that revisionism readily won out in the conflict with the previously accepted wartime lore, many of the traditionalists in the profession remained true to the mythology of the war decade. Not so long ago, one of the most eminent and revered of our professional historians, and a man who took a leading part in historical propaganda during the First World War, wrote that American historians had no reason to feel ashamed of their writings and operations in that period. That they had plenty to be ashamed of was revealed by C. Hartley Grattan in his article on, quote, "The Historians Cut Loose," in the American Mercury, reprinted in the form originally submitted to Mr. Mencken in my In Quest of Truth and Justice, and by Chapter 11 of my History of Historical Writing. In any event, the revisionist controversy was the outstanding intellectual adventure in the historical field in the 20th century down to Pearl Harbor. Revisionism, when applied to the First World War, showed that the actual causes and merits of that conflict were very close to the reverse of the picture presented in the political propaganda and historical writings of the war decade. Revisionism would also produce similar results with respect to the Second World War if it were allowed to develop unimpeded. But a determined effort is being made to stifle or silence revelations which would establish the truth with regard to the causes and issues of the late world conflict. While the wartime mythology endured for years after 1918, nevertheless, leading editors and publishers soon began to crave contributions, which set forth the facts with respect to the responsibility for the outbreak of the war in 1914, our entry into the war, and the basic issues involved in this great conflict. Sidney B. Fay began to publish his revolutionary articles on the background of the First World War in the American Historical Review in July 1920. My own efforts along the same line began in the New Republic, the Nation, the New York Times Current History magazine, and the Christian Century in 1924 and 1925. Without exception, the requests for my contributions came from the editors of these periodicals, and these requests were ardent and urgent. I had no difficulty whatever in securing the publication of my Genesis of the World War in 1926, and the publisher thereof subsequently brought forth a veritable library of illuminating revisionist literature. By 1928, when Fay's Origins of the World War was published, almost everyone except the diehards and bitter enders in the historical profession had come to accept revisionism, and even the general public had begun to think straight in the premises. quite a different situation faces the rise of any substantial revisionism after the Second World War. The question of war responsibility in relation to 1939 and 1941 is taken for granted as completely and forever settled. It is widely held that there can be no controversy this time, since it is admitted by all reasonable persons that Hitler was a dangerous neurotic who, with supreme folly, launched a war when he had everything to gain by peace. It is assumed that this takes care of the European aspects of the war guilt controversy. With respect to the Far East, this is supposed to be settled with equal finality by asking the question, Japan attacked us, didn't she? About as frequent as either of these ways of settling war responsibility for 1939 or 1941 is the vague but highly dogmatic statement that, quote, we had to fight, end quote. This judgment is usually rendered as a sort of ineffable categorical imperative which requires no further explanation. But some who are pressed for an explanation will allege that we had to fight to save the world from domination by Hitler, forgetting General George C. Marshall's report that Hitler, far from having any plan for world domination, did not even have any well worked out plan for collaborating with his Axis allies in limited wars, to say nothing of the gigantic task of conquering Russia. Surely, after June the 22nd, 1941, nearly 6 months before Pearl Harbor, there was no further need to fear any world conquest by Hitler. Actually, if historians have any professional self-respect and feel impelled to take cognizance of facts, there is far greater need for a robust and aggressive campaign of revisionism after the Second World War than there was in the years following 1918. The current semantic folklore about the responsibility for the Second World War, which is accepted not only by the public, but also by most historians, is far wider of the truth than even the most fantastic historical mythology which was produced after 1914, and the practical need for revisionism is even greater now than it was in the decade of the 1920s. The mythology which followed the outbreak of war in 1914 helped to produce the Treaty of Versailles and the Second World War. If world policy today cannot be divorced from the mythology of the 1940s, a third world war is inevitable, and its impact will be many times more horrible and devastating than that of the second. The lessons learned from the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials have made it certain that the Third World War will be waged with unprecedented savagery. Vigorous as was the resistance of many, including powerful vested historical interests, to the revisionism of the 1920s, it was as nothing compared to that which has been organized to frustrate and smother the truth relative to the Second World War. Revisionists in the 1920s only risked a brisk controversy. Those of today place in jeopardy both their professional reputation and their very livelihood at the hands of the quote-unquote Smeerbund. History has been the chief intellectual casualty of the Second World War and the Cold War which followed. In many essential features, the United States has moved along into the 1984 pattern of intellectual life. But there is one important and depressing difference. In 1984, Mr. Orwell shows that historians in that regime have to be hired by the government and forced to falsify facts. In this country today, and it is also true of most other nations, many professional historians gladly falsify history quite voluntarily and with no direct cost to the government. The ultimate and indirect cost may, of course, be a potent contribution to incalculable calamity. It may be said with great restraint that, Never since the Middle Ages have there been so many powerful forces organized and alerted against the assertion and acceptance of historical truth as are active today to prevent the facts about the responsibility for the Second World War and its results from being generally accessible to the American public. Even the great Rockefeller Foundation frankly admits the subsidizing of historians to anticipate and frustrate the development of any neo-revisionism in our time. And the only difference between this foundation and several others is that it has been more candid and forthright about its policies. The Sloan Foundation later supplemented this Rockefeller grant. Charles Austin Beard summarized the implications of such efforts with his characteristic vigor. Quote, "The Rockefeller Foundation and the Council on Foreign Relations intend to prevent, if they can, a repetition of what they call in the vernacular the debunking journalistic campaign following World War I. Translated into precise English, this means that the Foundation and the Council do not want journalists or any other persons to examine too closely and criticize too freely the official propaganda and official statements relative to our basic aims and activities during World War II. In short, they hope that, among other things, the policies and measures of Franklin D. Roosevelt will escape in the coming years the critical analysis, evaluation, and exposition that befell the policies and measures of Woodrow Wilson and the Entente Allies after World War I." End quote. As is the case with nearly all book publishers and periodicals, the resources of the great majority of the foundations are available only to scholars and writers who seek to perpetuate wartime legends and oppose revisionism. A good illustration is afforded by my experience with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which helped to subsidize the book by Professors Langer and Gleason. I mentioned this fact in the first edition of my brochure on The Court Historians versus Revisionism. Thereupon, I received a courteous letter from Mr. Alfred J. Zurcher, director of the Sloan Foundation, assuring me that the Sloan Foundation wished to be absolutely impartial and to support historical scholarship on both sides of the issue. He wrote in part, quote, "About the last thing we wish to do is to check and frustrate any sort of historical scholarship, since we believe that the more points of view brought to bear by disciplined scholars upon the war or any other historical event is in the public interest and should be encouraged." End quote. In the light of this statement, I decided to take Mr. Zurcher at his word. I had projected and encouraged a study of the foreign policy of President Hoover, which appeared to me a very important and much-needed enterprise, since it was during his administration that our foreign policy had last been conducted in behalf of peace and in the true public interest of the United States, rather than in behalf of some political party, foreign government, or dubious ideology. One of the most competent of American specialists in diplomatic history had consented to undertake the project, and he was not a man previously identified in any way with revisionist writing. My request was for exactly 1/30th of the grant allotted for the Langer-Gleason book. The statement was turned down by Mr. Zurcher with the summary statement, quote, "I regret that we are unable to supply the funds which you requested for Professor so-and-so's study." End quote. He even discouraged my suggestion that he discuss the idea in a brief conference with the professor in question. A state of abject terror and intimidation exists among the majority of professional American historians whose views accord with the facts on the question of historical responsibility for the Second World War. Several leading historians and publicists who have read my brochure on the struggle against the historical blackout have written me, stating that, on the basis of their own personal experience, it is an understatement of the facts. Yet the majority of those historians to whom it has been sent privately have feared even to acknowledge that they have received it or possess it. Only a handful have dared to express approval and encouragement. It is no exaggeration to say that the American Smeerbund, operating through newspaper editors and columnists, hatchet men, book reviewers, radio commentators, pressure group intrigue and espionage, and academic pressures and fears, has accomplished about as much in the way of intimidating honest intellectuals in this country as Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, the Gestapo, and concentration camps were able to do in Germany. The mental stalemate produced by this state of mind is well illustrated in the review by Professor Fred Harvey Harrington of Professor Charles C. Tansel's Back Door to War in the Political Science Quarterly of December 1952. Harrington, in private a moderate revisionist, goes so far as to state that there is, quote, no documentation, end quote, for Professor Tansel's statement that the, quote, main objective in American foreign policy since 1900 has been the preservation of the British Empire, end quote. This may be compared with the appraisal of the book by a resolute and unafraid revisionist, the eminent scholar, Professor George A. Lundberg, who in a review in Social Forces, April 1953, said with regard to the above contention by Tansel, quote, this thesis is documented to the hilt in almost 700 large pages, end quote. Moreover, the gullibility of many quote-unquote educated Americans has been as notable as the mendacity of the quote-unquote educators. In communist Russia and Nazi Germany, as well as in fascist Italy and in China, the tyrannical rulers found it necessary to suppress all opposition thought in order to induce the majority of the people to accept the material fed them by the official propaganda. But in the United States, with almost complete freedom of the press, speech, and information down to the end of 1941, great numbers of Americans followed the official propaganda line with no compulsion whatsoever. This is a remarkable and ominous contrast, especially significant because it has been the educated element which has been the most gullible in accepting official mythology, taking the population as a whole. And this situation has continued since 1945, though of course the public has been less able to get the truth from the avenues of information since VJ Day than it was before Pearl Harbor. The opposition to revisionism, that is, to truth in the premises, stems in part from emotional fixation on the mythology built up after 1937, and in part from personal loyalty to President Roosevelt and the naturally resulting desire to preserve the impeccability of the Roosevelt legend. In regard to the latter, the Roosevelt adulators are much more solicitous about defending their late chief's foreign policy than they are in upholding the infallibility of his much more creditable domestic program. There is, of course, a powerful vested political interest in perpetuating the acceptable mythology about the causes, issues, and results of the Second World War, for much of the public policy of the victorious United Nations since 1945 can only make sense and be justified on the basis of this mythology. In the United States, it was made the ideological basis of the political strategy of the Democratic Party and the main political instrument by which it maintained itself in power until 1953. It has also been accepted by many outstanding leaders of the opposition party. It has been indispensable in arousing support for the economic policies which have been used to ward off a depression, with its probably disastrous political reverberations. The eminent railroad executive and astute commentator on world affairs, Robert R. Young, has stated the facts here with realistic clarity in the Commercial and Financial Chronicle. Quote, "The clash between a foreign policy which makes sense to Americans and a foreign policy which makes sense to those who seek to perpetuate political office, patronage, or prominence is one which will only be resolved by prohibiting re-election. We are very naive when we describe American foreign policy of recent years as stupid. Indeed, that foreign policy has accomplished its object, for it has kept in power, patronage and prominence, election after election, those who conceived and facilitated it." End quote. Powerful pressure groups have also found the mythology helpful in diverting attention from their own role in national and world calamity. In addition to the opposition of public groups to the truths about responsibility for the Second World War, many historians and other social scientists have a strong professional and personal interest in perpetuating the pre-war and wartime mythology. One reason why numerous historians opposed the truth relative to responsibility for the First World War and the main issues therein was that so many of them had taken an active part in spreading the wartime propaganda and had also worked for Colonel House's committee in preparing material for the peacemaking. A considerable number of them went to Paris with President Wilson on his ill-fated adventure. Naturally, they were loath to admit that the enterprise in which they had played so prominent a part had proved to be both a fraud and a failure. Today, this situation has been multiplied manyfold. Historians and other social scientists veritably swarmed into the various wartime agencies after 1941, especially the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services. They were intimately associated with the war effort and with the shaping of public opinion to conform to the thesis of pure and limpid idealism and ethereal innocence of the United States, and of our exclusive devotion to self-defense and world betterment through the sword. Hence, the opposition of historians and social scientists to truth about the responsibility of the Second World War and its obvious results is many times greater than it was in the years following the close of the First World War. Since the war, several corps of court historians have volunteered to work to continue the elaboration of official mythology. In addition, the State Department and the Army and Navy have a great swarm of historians dedicated to presenting history as their employers wish it to be written. And at the present time, there is a new influx of American historians and social scientists into our Ministry of Truth. Part 3 of Chapter 1. How the Historical Blackout Operates. The methods followed by the various groups interested in blacking out the truth about world affairs since 1932 are numerous and ingenious, but aside from subterranean persecution of individuals, they fall mainly into the following patterns or categories. 1. Excluding scholars suspected of revisionist views from access to public documents which are freely open to court historians and other apologists for the foreign policy of President Roosevelt. 2. Intimidating publishers of books and periodicals, so that even those who might wish to publish books and articles setting forth the revisionist point of view do not dare to do so. 3. Ignoring or obscuring published material which embodies revisionist facts and arguments. And finally, 4. Smearing revisionist authors and their books. Subsection 1. Denying access to public documents. There is a determined effort to block those suspected of seeking the truth from having access to official documents, other than those which have become public property. The outstanding official and court historians, such as Samuel Eliot Morison, William L. Langer, Herbert Feiss, and the like, are given free access to the official archives. Only such things as the most extreme top secrets, like the so-called Kent documents and Professor Roosevelt's communications with King George VI, carefully guarded at Hyde Park, are denied to them. Otherwise, they have freedom of access to official documents and the important private diaries of leading public officials. Many of these important sources are, however, completely sealed off from any historian who is suspected of desiring to ascertain the full and unbiased truth with regard to American foreign policy since 1933. The man who is probably the outstanding scholarly authority on American diplomatic history found himself barred from many of the more important documents. Moreover, many of the notes which he had taken down from those documents he had been permitted to examine were later confiscated by State Department officials. If the complete official documents would support the generally accepted views with respect to the causes and issues of the war, there would seem to be no reasonable objection to allowing any reputable historian to have free and unimpeded access to such materials. As Charles Austin Beard concisely stated the matter, official archives must be open to all citizens on equal terms, with special privileges for none. Inquiries must be wide and deep as well as uncensored, and the competition of ideas in the forum of public opinion must be free from political interests or restraints." End quote. The importance of freedom of the archives to writers of sound historical material has also been commented upon by the editor of the London Times Literary Supplement of April the 18th, 1952, in relation to the appearance of Professors William L. Langer and S. E. Gleason's The Struggle Against Isolationism, 1937 to 1940, which was produced by the Rockefeller Foundation subsidy mentioned above. Quote, "Once the principle is accepted that governments grant access to their archives to certain chosen historians and refuse it to others, it would be unrealistic to ignore the temptation that may arise in the future to let the choice fall on historians who are most likely to share the official view of the moment and to yield readily to discreet official promptings as to what is suitable, what is unsuitable for publication. When this happens, the last barrier on the road to quote-unquote official history will have fallen." End quote. Subsection 2. Difficulties in publishing revisionist materials. Some might sense that there is a seeming inconsistency between the statement that there has been an attempt to black out revisionism after the Second World War and the undoubted fact that important revisionist books have appeared sooner and in greater number since the Second World War than they did after 1918. This gratifying situation in no way contradicts what has been said above relative to the far more vigorous opposition to revisionism since 1945. Nearly all publishers were happy to publish revisionist volumes after 1918, or at least after 1923. But not a single major publisher has issued a revisionist book since 1945. Neither is there any evidence that one will do so for years to come. Had not Charles Austin Beard possessed a devoted friend in Eugene Davidson of the Yale University Press, and had not the firms of Henry Regnery and Devin Adair been in existence, it is very unlikely that not one revisionist book would have come from the press following VJ Day. For not only are historians who seek to establish the truth prevented from getting much of the material which they need, they also find it very difficult to secure the publication of books embodying such of the truth as they have been able to assemble from the accessible documents. It would naturally be assumed that the first book to give the full inside information on the attack at Pearl Harbor would have been an exciting publishing adventure, and that the manuscript would have been eagerly sought after by any and all book publishing firms. Such, however, was far from the facts. After canvassing the publishing opportunities, George Morgenstern found that the Devon Adair Company was the only one which had the courage to bring out his brilliant book, Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War, in 1947. Charles Austin Beard informed me that he was so convinced that none of his former commercial publishers would print his critical account of the Roosevelt foreign policy that he did not regard it even as worthwhile to inquire. He was fortunate enough to have a courageous friend who was head of one of the most important university presses in the country. The fourth important revisionist book to push its way through the blackout ramparts was William Henry Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade. The history of the publication difficulties in connection with the book showed that, in the publishing world, there was no more inclination in 1950 than there had been previously to publish the truth with respect to President Roosevelt's foreign policy and the Second World War. Chamberlain is a distinguished author. He's written many important books, and they have been published by leading publishing houses. But none of his former commercial publishers was interested in the manuscript, though it is probably the most timely and important work Chamberlain has written. The head of one large publishing house, himself a noted publicist, declared his deep personal interest in the book, but stated that he did not feel it ethical to jeopardize the financial interests of his company through risking retaliation from the Blackout contingent. 2 university presses turned down the manuscript, though in each case the director attested to the great merit of the book. That it was finally brought out was due to the courage and public spirit of Henry Regnery, who has published more realistic books relative to the Second World War than all other American publishers combined. Yet, Chamberlain's book is neither sensational nor extreme. It is no more than an honest and actually restrained statement of the facts that every American citizen needs to have at hand if we are to avoid involvement in a devastating, fatal Third Crusade. A fifth revisionist book, Designed for War, by an eminent New York attorney and expert on international law, Frederick R. Sanborn, appeared in early 1951. It was published by the Devon Adair Company, which also brought out Mr. Morgenstern's volume. The sixth and definitive revisionist volume, Professor Charles Callan Tansel's Back Door to War, The Roosevelt Foreign Policy, 1933 to 1941, was published by Regnery. Professor Tansel's previous publishers were not interested in the book. In a trenchant article on, quote, A Case History in Book Publishing, in the American Quarterly, winter of 1949, the distinguished university press editor, W.T. Couch, tells of the difficulties met with in inducing commercial publishers to print revisionist books, and he goes into detail about the problems encountered in securing a publisher for A. Frank Reel's courageous book, The Case of General Yamashita. And I will interrupt the text at this moment to say that that is an excellent book. The Case of General Yamashita is not well known, and it shows that the American policy and the policy of the Allies was pretty much the same whether they were dealing with Germans or Japanese, because they did the same thing to General Yamashita over there that they did to the Germans at Nuremberg. Now we'll return to the text. As a matter of fact, only 2 small publishing houses in the United States, the Henry Regnery Company and the Devon Adair Company, have shown any consistent willingness to publish books which frankly aim to tell the truth with respect to the causes and issues of the Second World War. Leading members of two of the largest publishing houses in the country have told me that, whatever their personal wishes in the circumstances, they would not feel it ethical to endanger their business and the property rights of their stockholders by publishing critical books relative to American foreign policy since 1933. And there's good reason for this hesitancy. The book clubs and the main sales outlets for books are controlled by powerful pressure groups which are opposed to truth on such matters. These outlets not only refuse to market critical books in the field, but also threaten to boycott other books by those publishers who defy their blackout ultimatum. When such books do get into the bookstores, the sales department frequently refuses to display or promote them. It required the personal intervention of the head of America's largest retail store to ensure that one of the leading critical volumes was displayed upon the counter of the book department of the store. In the American Legion Monthly, February 1951, Irene Kuhn revealed the efforts of many bookstores to discourage the buying of books critical of administration foreign policy. A striking example of how blackout pressures are able to discourage the sale of revisionist books is the experience at Macy's in New York City with the Chamberlain book. Macy's ordered 50 copies and returned 40 as unsold. If the book could have been distributed on its merits, Macy's would certainly have sold several thousand copies. Not only are private sales discouraged, but equally so are sales to libraries. Mr. Regnery discovered that, 6 months after its publication, there was not one copy of the Chamberlain book in any of the 45 branches of the New York City Public Library. Another sampling study of the situation in libraries throughout the country showed that the same situation prevailed in most of the nation's libraries, not only in respect to the Chamberlain book, but also in the case of other revisionist volumes like John T. Flynn's The Roosevelt Myth. Some of the reasons stated for this are explained by Oliver Carlson in an article on, quote, Slanted Guide to Library Selections in the Freeman, January the 14th, 1952. As an example, the most influential librarian in the United States has described George Orwell's 1984 as, quote, paranoia in literature, end quote. The attempt to suppress or exclude revisionist materials from publication extends beyond the book publishing trade. Whereas in the late 1920s and early 1930s, all of the more important periodicals were eager to publish competent revisionist articles by reputable scholars, no leading American magazine will today bring out a frank revisionist article, no matter what the professional distinction of the author. Most of them, indeed, even refuse to review revisionist books. The Progressive has been the only American periodical which has, with fair consistency, kept its columns open to such material, and its circulation is very limited. While the periodicals are closed to neo-revisionist materials, they are, of course, wide open and eager for anything which continues the wartime mythology. If the authors of such mythology did not feel reasonably assured that answers to their articles could not be published, it is unlikely that they would risk printing such amazing whitewash as that by General Sherman Miles on, quote, Pearl Harbor in retrospect in the Atlantic Monthly of July 1948, and Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's vehement attack on Charles Austin Beard in the August 1948 issue of the same magazine. Now, Admiral Morrison is an able historian of nautical matters and a charming man personally, but his pretensions to anything like objectivity in weighing the responsibility for the Second World War can hardly be sustained. In his foreword to Morrison's Battle of the Atlantic, the late James Forrestal let the cat out of the bag. He revealed that, as early as 1942, Morrison had suggested to President Roosevelt that the right kind of history of naval operations during the war should be written, and modestly offered his quote-unquote services to do the job, so as to reflect proper credit upon the administration. Roosevelt and Secretary Knox heartily agreed to this proposition, and Morrison was given a commission as captain in the Naval Reserve to write the official history of naval operations in the Second World War. If Roosevelt and Knox were alive today, they would have no reason to regret their choice of an historian. But as a court historian and a hired man, however able, of Roosevelt and Knox, Admiral Morrison's qualifications to take a bow to von Ranke and pass stern judgment on the work of Beard, whom no administration or party was ever able to buy, are not convincing. President Truman's announcement in the newspapers on January the 14th, 1951, indicated that Morrison's services had been recognized and that he is apparently to be court historian-in-chief during the opening phases of our official entry into the 1984 system. But Morrison's various attacks on Beard were handled with appropriate severity by Professor Howard K. Beale in his address before the American Historical Association on December 28, 1952, published in the August 1953 issue of the Pacific Historical Review. Another example of the accessibility of our leading periodicals to anti-revisionist materials was the publication of many articles smearing the reputation of Beard at the time of his death. Some of the most bitter articles appearing in journals that had earlier regarded Beard as one of their most distinguished and highly welcome contributors. Equally illustrative of the tendency to welcome any defense of the traditional mythology and exclude contrary opinions was the publication of the somewhat irresponsible article by Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. on Roosevelt and his detractors in the June 1950 issue of Harper's Magazine. It was obviously proper for the editor to publish this article, but not equally defensible was his inability to quote-unquote find space for the publication of an answer, even by one of the most outstanding contributors to Harper's. Most of the professional historical magazines are as completely closed to the truth concerning the responsibility for and merits of the Second World War as are the popular periodicals. Likewise, the great majority of our newspapers are highly hostile to material questioning the traditional mythology about the causes and results of this war. The aversion of the New York Times to the truth about Pearl Harbor 10 years later is dealt with below. Subsection 3. Ignoring or obscuring revisionist books. In case a revisionist book squeezes through the publishing blackout, almost invariably as a result of the courage of the two small publishing houses mentioned above, the blackout strategists are well prepared to circumvent the possibility of its gaining any wide circulation or popular acceptance. The most common procedure is to accord such books the silent treatment, namely, to refuse to review them at all. As one powerful pressure group has pointed out, this is the most effective way of nullifying the potential influence of any book. Even highly hostile and critical reviews attract attention to a book and may arouse controversy which will further publicize it. The silent treatment assures a stillbirth to virtually any volume. The late Oswald Garrison Villard recounts his own personal experience with the silent treatment strategy of editors today. Quote, I myself rang up a magazine which some months previously had asked me to review a book for them and asked if they would accept another review from me. The answer was, yes, of course. What book had you in mind? I replied, Morgenstern's Pearl Harbor. Oh, that's the new book attacking FDR and the war, isn't it? Yes. Well, how do you stand on it? I believe, since his book is based on the records of the Pearl Harbor inquiry, he is right. Oh, we don't handle books of that type. It's against our policy to do so. End quote. The Henry Regnery Company of Chicago has been more courageous and prolific in the publication of substantial revisionist books than any other concern here or abroad. It has brought out such important books as Leonhard von Muralt, From Versailles to Potsdam, Hans Rothfeld's The German Opposition to Hitler, Victor Gallantz's In Darkest Germany, Frida Utley's The High Cost of Vengeance, Montgomery Belgian's Victor's Justice, Lord Hankey's Politics, Trials, and Errors, William Henry Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade, and Charles Callan Tansel's Backdoor to War. Mr. Regnery has shown me a careful survey of the treatment accorded to these books by our leading newspapers and periodicals. Some have not been reviewed at all. Most of them were reviewed sparingly. Almost invariably, when they have been noticed, they have been attacked with great ferocity and uniform unfairness. The obscuring of the neo-revisionist material may be further illustrated by the space and position assigned to the reviews of Beard's American Foreign Policy in the Making, 1932 to 1940, and Morgenstern's Pearl Harbor in the American Historical Review and in other leading newspapers and periodicals. Despite the revolutionary nature and vast importance of the Beard book, it was given only a page in the American Historical Review, but amusingly enough, the reviewer used the brief space at his disposal to praise the book. This was not allowed to happen again. Though Morgenstern's book was perhaps the most important single volume published in the field of American history in the year 1947, it was relegated to a booknote in the American Historical Review and was roundly smeared. Of all the book reviewing columnists in New York City papers, only one reviewed Morgenstern's book, and he smeared it. The Saturday Review of Literature ignored it completely, and so did most of the other leading periodicals. Though many infinitely less important books, from the standpoint of timeliness and intrinsic merit of content, received front-page positions therein, neither the Morgenstern book nor the Beard volume was given this place in the Sunday book review sections of the New York Times or Herald Tribune. Had these books ardently defended the Roosevelt legend, they would assuredly have been assigned front-page positions. As Oswald Villard remarked of the Beard volume, quote, "Had it been a warm approval of FDR and his war methods, I will wager whatever press standing I have that it would have been featured on the first pages of the Herald Tribune books and the Times literary section, and received unbounded praise from Walter Millis, Allen Nevins, and similar other axemen." End quote. Mr. Villard's prophecy was vindicated after his death, when the supreme effort to salvage the reputation of Roosevelt and his foreign policy appeared in W. L. Langer and S. E. Gleason's Challenge to Isolation, 1937 to 1940. It was promptly placed on the front page of the Herald Tribune Book Review of January the 20th, 1952, and praised in lavish fashion. Beard's book, on President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941, was so challenging that it could not be ignored. But it did not gain front-page position in either the New York Times or the Herald Tribune. Though reviewed in a number of newspapers and periodicals, the majority of the reviewers sought to discredit the book rather than to examine its facts and arguments in a spirit of fairness and integrity. Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade was nowhere near as widely reviewed as the significance of the content of the book merited, irrespective of whether or not one agreed with all of the author's conclusions. It was the first comprehensive and critical appraisal of the nature and results of the most momentous project in which the United States was ever involved, politically, economically, or militarily. Hence, it merited careful and extended examination by every newspaper and periodical in the land, but it was reviewed in only a fraction of the leading newspapers, while most of the important periodicals, including the American Historical Review, ignored it entirely. In the 1920s, periodicals like the New Republic and the Nation would have reviewed a book of this type lyrically and at great length, and in all probability have published special articles and editorials praising it warmly. Most reviews which the Chamberlain book received were of the smearing variety. The New York Times and Herald Tribune both reviewed the book in hostile fashion, gave it very brief reviews, and placed these in an obscure position. Frederick R. Sanborn's able and devastating Design for War received about the same treatment as the Chamberlain volume. It was ignored by the great majority of the newspapers and by virtually all the important periodicals. The New York Times reviewed the book rather promptly, if not conspicuously, but handed it over to their leading academic hatchet man, Samuel Flagg Bemis. Although prodded by Sanborn, the Herald Tribune delayed the review from March to August and then assigned it to Gordon A. Craig, a leading anti-revisionist among the historians frequently employed by the Times and Herald Tribune in attacking books critical of Roosevelt foreign policy. Sanborn's book was not reviewed at all by Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, The Nation, The New Republic, Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, or the Saturday Review of Literature, though Sanborn wrote letters of inquiry to all of them. Correspondence with the Saturday Review of Literature from April to the end of September failed to produce a review. If a comparable book had appeared at any time between 1923 and 1935, there is every reason to believe that the Nation and New Republic, for example, would have hailed it with near hysterical joy and given excessive space to praising and promoting it. The American Historical Review did not review or even notice the Sanborn volume. So far as can be ascertained at the time these lines are revised in December 1952, Charles Callan Tansel's Back Door to War was treated by the press in essentially the same manner as it had handled the Chamberlain and Sanborn volumes, although it is the definitive revisionist contribution and deserves as much consideration as Sidney B. Fay's Origin of the World War received in 1928. It received slightly more attention than did Chamberlain and Sanborn in the newspapers, perhaps because a determined effort was made to get the book in the hands of the editor of every important newspaper in the country. The majority of the newspaper reviews were of a smearing nature. As one example of such a review by an interventionist newspaper, we may cite the following from the San Francisco Chronicle of July the 27th, 1952. Quote, "To bring forth a very small mouse, Professor Tansel has labored mountainously to assemble this helter-skelter collection of facts, documents, and hearsay about America's pre-war policy. This book is not history. It is awkward, special pleading." End quote. The author of the review hid behind the initials MS. The book failed to make the front page of either the New York Times Book Review or the New York Herald Tribune Book Review. It was reviewed on page 3 of the former, May the 11th, 1952, and page 10 of the latter, June the 1st, 1952, rather briefly in both cases. Even so, Dexter Perkins, who reviewed the book for the Times, had to request twice the space originally assigned. Among the important periodicals, only the Freeman, the Saturday Review of Literature, and the Nation reviewed the book, the latter two rather belatedly. Time, Newsweek, The Atlantic, and Harper's gave the volume the silent treatment, ignoring it entirely. The editor of the New Republic treated the book to an almost obscene smear. In the 1920s, all of these periodicals, which were then in existence, would have reviewed the book promptly and at length, and it would have evoked almost frenzied ecstasy on the part of the nation and new republic. The jaundiced and biased attitude of the periodicals in reviewing or ignoring such books as these was well revealed at the time of the appearance of the ardently pro-Roosevelt masterpiece by W. L. Langer and S. E. Gleason, Challenge to Isolation, 1937 to 1940. In this instance, virtually all of the magazines which had ignored the books by Morgenstern, Chamberlain, Sanborn, and Tansel immediately rushed into print with prominent and lyrical reviews of the Langer-Gleason volume. Among all the editors of professional journals in the historical and social sciences field, only Professor Howard W. Odum, editor of Social Forces, has been willing to open his publication to full and fair reviewing of revisionist volumes. One of the most impressive examples of the ignoring and obscuring of the writings of men critical of our foreign policy since 1937 is presented by the case of Francis Nielsen. Mr. Nielsen is a distinguished publicist, and he served as a member of Parliament before he came to the United States. He was the principal angel of the original Freeman, and like John T. Flynn, was once a darling of American liberals, who were in those days revisionists and anti-interventionists. Mr. Nielsen's How Diplomats Make War, 1915, was the first revisionist volume to be published on the First World War, and it is still read with respect. When Mr. Nielsen opposed our interventionism after 1937, his erstwhile liberal friends fell away from him. Being a man of means, he was able to publish his gigantic 5-volume work, The Tragedy of Europe, privately. It was scarcely noticed in any review, though it was praised by no less a personage than President Robert Maynard Hutchins of the University of Chicago. In 1950, Mr. Nielsen published, again privately, a condensation of the more vital portions of his larger work, entitling it The Makers of War. The book contains a great amount of valuable revisionist material, not embodied in any other revisionist volume on the Second World War, but Mr. Nielsen assured me personally it has never been reviewed at all.